Good morning, good morning, good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's second episode of Spilling Tea. I'm your host, Tiffany Daniels, and yes, we're going back to the sheltered workshops. In fact, today we're going to be going over the history. It might be a long video, so kind of. What do the British say, tuck in? I think that's usually when they're about to eat, but whatever. All right. First to the disclaimers, right? For once, I'm not going to rant before it, no matter how much I want to. Just no, folks, the only thing I'm going to say as an autistic who's been people watching since I was a young kid, y'all are getting extremely illogical. And I get closer and closer to turning into a female version of Spock every day. Anyways, you're going to see the link to this particular article as well as the one for yesterday's video right there in the description box alongside all the usual ones. Now, folks, on this channel, on occasion, you may hear profanities. If your child is 16 and younger and they are watching this, please, parental supervision is very much advised, all right? Okay. So, Sheltered Workshops, History and Definition. This was originally published back in 2014. It got updated in 2021. This is from Disabled World. So let's go over the synopsis here. I'm going to kind of break it down for you, okay? Information and history of the term sheltered workshops in relation to disabilities. The oldest influence is one that had its origin in the religious protection of people with disabilities. Since the church was the first charitable organization, inevitably some lines of the workshop movement have strong ties to religion. Oh, big time, folks. Big time. Unrelated story, because as far as I know, there's no religious connections to the one that was out there in Nixa, but there are a lot of disability organizations and what have you that have very strong ties to the churches out here, particularly the Protestant mega churches. In fact, when I was living in assisted living, there was a particular van that came by every Sunday to take everybody to church. I don't agree with Baptists. Obviously, St. Augustine, right? So I did not use that particular service. But yeah. Moving on. A main concern of the church for its wards with disabilities was their souls and bodies in relation to moral uplift and spiritual redemption more than vocational rehabilitation and physical restoration. This is why, don't get me wrong, obviously, Catholic. What I don't like in particular is the marriage out here in particular with the mega churches and state services. Reason why is more often than not, these mega churches don't really keep up with modern medical science, nor do they keep up to date really with the concepts of disability and just exactly what we're capable of. I think that services for the disabled should not discourage practicing your faith, but I also don't feel like they need to be married to the churches. If you are trying to prep transition age kids, remember that's my area of expertise here in particular. If you're dealing with transition age kids, and you're trying to prepare them out there for the real world, right? For those of us who have managed to transition out into the real world, we can tell you, unless you are working directly for a church or a church business that is defined as Christian themed, a good majority of the jobs you're going to find out there are separate from religion. So something like this is not going to really prepare these kids for a workplace that is very much secular. Let's move on, shall we? That's its own debate. This is how I get in trouble with people out here. Ask me if I care. Okay, main digest. Sheltered workshops first appeared in America more than a century ago as an outgrowth of the special schools for the blind, whose curricula concentrated on the provision of simple forms of vocational training and limited manual skills such as knitting, weaving, chair caning, as well as music and other arts. At first, it was hoped by educators that people who were blind with appropriate instruction would be able to maintain themselves free of charge from their friends or the state. Sadly, however, nothing has been done to persuade society of the capabilities of the blind trainees. Before long, graduates started returning, representing the embarrassment of their condition abroad and soliciting employment. Due to this, sheltered workshops as segregated places of permanent employment for people regarded by society as being unemployable were begun. This is where that systemic ableism comes in, folks, and we're still very much facing it every single day. There's a reason why, in spite of having gone to college and gotten a degree, I have never spent one day working in my field. Why? Because I am an outspoken autistic self advocate and disability rights advocate. I'm known for it. And what people think that people with disabilities are capable of out here is absolutely abysmal. And what's even worse, they convince the parents, starting real early, day one of diagnosis, they go through a list of things, I know because I've been through this myself, of what they say the kids are never going to be able to do. Now imagine that sinking into a parent's head for over 18 years. What are they going to be thinking, right? Let's move on, shall we? While sheltered workshops emerged a century ago, their ancestry can be traced at least to the Middle Ages. It is possible to distinguish four separate historical associations from which workshops today derive. Those are the school, the church, hospital, and workhouse. I will say, I'll give my state one thing. One thing. When it comes to working to the transition job programs out here that are outside of the workshops, Mercy hospitals and Cox have both been absolutely amazing since we've been trying to work towards transitioning people out into the real workforce. These folks have been absolutely incredible. There are many people with disabilities right now that are working Mercy. They act as janitors, they help in the gift stores. Many of them go into the food service side of the hospitals, but they pay these guys minimum wage. Many of these folks started during early transition high school, where they first started volunteering and learning this type of work, and to which they then graduated once they came out of high school, if they decide not to go into secondary education, into full-time work at these same facilities. It's actually had pretty good results. I'm saying that. However, the types of jobs that are usually designated for people with disabilities out here: fast food, food service, janitorial work. That's pretty much it. I managed to piss off a lot of people, being one of the individuals that managed to break that stereotype. Now, granted, I've kind of been pigeonholed into call center work for about 13 years, not because I like it or enjoy it, but because these are the only people who will hire me. But that's neither here nor there. Let's move on, shall we? Did say sometimes I get into ranting. Since the traces of this extensive heritage may still be seen in a number of sheltered workshops today, It's helpful to briefly examine the sources and character of these influences. The oldest influence is the one that had its origin in the religious protection of people with disabilities. Since the church was the first charitable organization, inevitably some lines of workshop movement have strong ties to religion. History doesn't back that up, though. Someone who studied ancient history and mythologies and all of that, although it's one of the most well known, there was other forms of charity before the advent of Christianity. But that, again, that's another story, right? When the physically disabled, indigent, and those who were mentally different were herded into asylums in the 1700s, they were being brought together not to ameliorate their conditions, but simply to get them off the streets. A main concern of the church for its wards with disabilities was that their souls and bodies to relation to moral uplift and spiritual redemption more than with vocational rehabilitation and physical restoration. And they haven't deviated that far from those original principles from the Middle Ages, folks. It is still, when you talk with individuals who defend these workshops, you will hear very much, but it uplifts them and gives them a sense of achievement. Okay, but they can't survive with pennies on the dollar, Karen. Medicaid, especially out in this state, is not the end all be all of insurance, Karen. You're still regulating us to a life of poverty, Karen. But let's move on. Among of the privately operated workshops, these remain the main goals of the workshop activity. One organization sponsors dozens of workshops. Goodwill Industries may be the most successful of all the mission or church sponsored workshop chains. A corollary line of development from which the current workshop has emerged is that of the medieval and early modern hospital, which, like the asylum, was usually under church auspices, yet might be distinguished in terms of its specific function. European hospitals of the early 16th century were described by one observer as those places where the sick and are fed and cared for, where a certain number of paupers are supported, where boys and girls are reared, where abandoned infants are nourished, where the insane are confined and the blind dwell. The purpose of the hospital was mainly to care for those who were sick or completely disabled. Yet the bedlam, hold on, gotta move up here so I can see it, created by its population were also the rudiments of nursery school, almshouse, and insane asylum. Present-day workshops that incorporate the provision of medical and therapeutic services might be received as the outcome of a line of development reaching back to the medieval hospital, extending through the American county hospitals of more recent times, institutions which also desire to fulfill the double function of healing the ill and the employment of the disabled. Another notable precursor to the sheltered workshop was the workhouse or almshouse, which evolved to an institution of work relief accompanied by the poor laws of the 16th and 17th centuries. In relation to present, the main importance of the workhouse was that it was designed not primarily for the sick or disabled, but for the poor who were able-bodied. The workhouse provided an institutionalized form of relief for the poor, in keeping with the Elizabethan assumptions of the characterological causes of poverty. It was made as disagreeable as possible and its wages held to a bare minimum above starvation, so few willingly pursue admission or remain. The gospel of work as the means of salvation essentially converted the almshouse into a forced labor camp. The distinction between workhouse and jailhouse was many times hard to discern. There we go, folks. It's still prevalent today, even with our current medical model separated from religion. But do they always basically make people with disabilities, particularly here, my fellows with physical disabilities, feel? It's all about, well, if you can't produce, then you're worthless. Right? Right? Which we all know is a bunch of garbage. But yeah. Moving on. Shelter workshops grew up as adjuncts of the special schools for the blind established in the 19th century. It's significant that these schools soon deliberately cut their connection with the shops they had created, as it became apparent that the functions of education and employment could not reasonably be mixed in the same program. after this, workshops became operated independently of custodial and educational institutions. The historical development of modern welfare philosophy has been one of the increasing recognition of the needed distinctions and incompatibilities among these in phases and approaches to the issue of disability. Some among them, notably that of the workhouse and almshouse, potentially also to some extent that of the religious mission, have come to be recognized as anachronisms. Others, such as vocational training emphasis of the early schools and the sheltered work conception, still retain some level of support in the welfare theory and policy. Yet it is clear that the direction of progress has been entirely away from the primitive idea of an encompassing bedlam in which all of those who are ill, disabled, rejected, or despised members of society would not be thrown together, in which various dissimilar functions of school, church, factory, hospital, and prison would be carried on. What remains to be seen is whether the statutes of the states governing their publicly operated sheltered workshops have kept pace with the direction of progress. They haven't, folks. Not out here, they haven't. Send help. The most notable recent battle has to do with wages paid to those who labor in the sheltered workshops. So that gives you some of the history here. And wow, not quite as long as we would like. So let's kind of get into this, okay? A lot of these places continue to exist because there is systemic ableism still very easily seen throughout the entirety of our world, but in particular in the United States. Where did we develop out of? The Puritans, right? The Puritans. I say this as a daughter of the Revolution, by the way. I am not discounting my own family's role. Just saying. It's this idea that the worth of a human being can only be determined by how much we produce. Right? Right. Yeah. That. So, what do? Well, if you can't be productive as an able bodied person, they're going to throw you in these workshops. Here's the thing, though. If they are able and capable to do these jobs at the workshops, why are we so convinced that they cannot do similar work out there in the real world? That's my argument. And if they are able to go out there and do similar work out in the real world, why do we still have places like this? It's because these individuals out there, these so-called good hearts, well, a good majority of them aren't very familiar with us or our capabilities. They hold on to very old, outdated views of people with disability and just what we are actually capable of. There's this weird thing, though. Most people who support these sheltered workshops don't know what they do there. Or those that do assume that this is just easier work than what you can find out in a competitive workplace. As someone who's very familiar with workshops, as well as the warehouses out here, including places like Craft, it's the exact same work. So you gotta wonder, if we have places like Craft, why aren't we reaching out? Why aren't job programs reaching out to places like Craft, like these other warehouse workers places, in order to help integrating us into job positions like those? Because I know what those Craft warehouse workers make. They make more than I do. Way more than I do. If you were to put someone there as opposed to place them in a sheltered workshop where they're making pennies on the dollar, you better bet they're actually going to have more than enough money to be able to not just support themselves and live out here in the regular world like the rest of us, but also have decent insurance that would be able to cover things that Medicaid won't. You know what I'm saying? However, with systemic ableism, with the fear that these doctors put into these parents, but these kids are all very young. They live under this constant fear that if they lose all their benefits, their kid's going to end out on the street. It's not true, folks. We've got to get away from this idea. Because if these individuals are able to perform their jobs at these sheltered workshops, then logic would dictate that they would be able to perform the same type of similar work out there also in the competitive workplace. So why aren't we doing it? Why do we continue to fearmonger with people with disabilities? Why are we continuing to encourage them to stay under subpar Section 8 housing, which is its own topic, I might add, food stamps, and Medicaid? When in the competitive workplace, they would have access to far better benefits. That's the question I'm going to leave you with for this video. Now that we've gone over the history, we're going to go into a few more things, such as how these places function. But we're going to go ahead and close out for now. We don't get very many views on this channel. The few that we do get do tend to get removed from time to time. So folks, please don't forget to hit the like button, hit subscribe. Don't forget to hit the comments. I do appreciate your time. And as always, we here at Spilling Tea do hope you have a good one. Bye-bye, everyone.